I was actually a manager 20 years ago. That's me 20 years ago as a cook. I was a terrible manager as a cook in a restaurant. I think my cooking was okay, but I wasn't great at managing people, but I hope I've learned a lot over these years. Outside of work, I'm a pretty keen surfer and I love old Japanese cars. So that's pretty much me. So why did I do this talk? Starting out in my career, I can describe what I only saw as some pretty poor examples of management. Reactions like this that I saw from my colleagues, I saw done in different organisations, the idea that you should work yourself to death almost because, I think the term now is hardcore engineer or some kind of crap like that. So anyway, didn't like it a lot. What I saw was a lot of people getting into management roles because of their intellectual capability, but I guess their emotional capability probably less so, leading to some pretty unhappy teams and some pretty toxic work environments as well. And while we wanted to talk more about diversity and inclusion in our teams, these were generally scrapped because we had a tech role that just needed to be filled. This person had the skills, we'll put them in there, and we didn't worry too much about how they would actually go working in a team or an environment. So not a lot of great experiences there, and generally when people want to understand careers and comp and things like that, it tended to be a bit hidden. So for me personally, this is why I got into management. I wanted to at least try and see if I could actually make a difference, if I could actually try and be better for other people as well. Some things I'll tell you about being a manager in tech is that you won't sleep well every night. And that's not just because you're an escalation point for pages, but you often have to have a lot of conversations. There is a bit of emotional labour involved in managing teams of people. Sometimes you've got to prepare for a conversation the next day that's not going to be good, and you don't tend to sleep very well. Because humans aren't perfectly rational creatures, and I know myself I am not. And I can assure you that these things don't exist. There is no perfect organisation I've ever worked in that has work management processes that just seem to work so fluidly and so beautifully that your work is just constant wonder. Doesn't happen. And a lot of times, those top-down directives, they don't make any sense whatsoever, but you need to do them. On the flip side, what I do love about my job is when things go well, they're just great. If you've got a really good team of people, if you're working on really interesting work, if you have a strong sense of trust and community within your teams, it's great, it's awesome. Because you can have a strong impact on things and you can be a force for good. If you love working with people, if you want to see their careers grow, management roles are great for that. They're really, really good. And I guess for me personally, that's what I enjoy the most out of the role. So, these terms, I guess in my mind, they sometimes get conflated or confused, so I'm going to define them. I'm going to define management like this, and I'm going to define leadership like that. Some of you may go, yeah, maybe not quite, Andrew, but let's just try and work with this as much as possible. They're relationships. So because we work in tech and we love quadrants, so if I put management on one side and leadership on the other, generally if you're working in an organisation where it's pretty low, it's probably total chaos. If you work in a very large company, generally has a very well embedded products, generally revenue is great. They tend to double down more on management because they don't need to innovate. They don't need to change the core business very much. So you tend to see a little more bureaucracy and a little bit slower to move. If you're in a smaller company, generally a startup or something like that, I've seen more highly innovative things. You may pivot immediately from several core strategic things that you're doing because they're probably not going to work out in the end and you're in a more competitive marketplace. And you get high levels of both, you're working in an awesome company. I see most companies that I've worked in, they float sort of around this quadrant all the time in their lifetimes. So, if you want to learn about them, if you want to understand management, leadership, there's some good books. You can read these. You can also read these if you want to. I'm not even getting started. You could even read these. They may come with a warning label, especially the one on the right, but it's worth reading. Honestly, it's worth reading. If you go through all those previous ones, read that one and understand how far we've come and probably what not to do. We're an SRE conference, you probably should read these. You probably should read these if you want to learn about incidents. You should probably also look at some of these if you want to understand the meta view of or ways in which you can learn more about management, leadership, and indeed very complex systems. Shout out to the LFI community who put me on the path for some of these. But what on earth does this really have to do with being an SRE manager? All right, because there is a lot of crossovers. So let's go into this a little bit more. So you're an SRE manager. Here's some facets of the role. Here's the kind of things I deal or have dealt with. Your organisation has a big strategy. What are we going to do to win? How are we going to just capture this huge segment of the marketplace? This is a very product and strategic level, but down at the SRE level, you've still got to turn this into action. Like, what are you going to contribute? How are you going to make sure that these things get realised? You'll have to manage a budget. So you'll have to get more familiar with financial terms, CapEx, OpEx, charts of accounts, general ledgers, cost center codes. All this stuff starts entering into your brain. You'll have to deal with vendors, some great to deal with, some not so great to deal with. You'll have to deal with legal because you will occasionally be doing contracts as well, and they need to be vetted, they need to be checked. You have to coordinate all of this. You may also have an entertainment budget. I guess in this current macro environment, you're probably not doing that very much at the moment, but when times are good, you certainly have to. The people side is a huge part of the role. Sometimes you have disagreements. Sometimes they can be intense. Sometimes you need to play a mediator. Ultimately, you will spend a part of your job doing this kind of work. It's not in the job description. You don't tend to go to college for it, but it is part of your role. And sometimes you have to agree to part ways. It's the worst part of the job. I hate it, but sometimes it happens. Hiring is probably the part of the job, one of the jobs I love the most. It's great being able to hire new people. It's great meeting people. It's great seeing how, when you're looking at your team, the problems you have to solve and how you want your team to be. Hiring is a great way to change things. And there's also the twice yearly calibration sessions where you as a manager will want to ensure you're putting the best foot forward for your team because they're going to be assessed against all other teams and engineers in your organisation. You'll have tactical work processes. You'll have strategic ones. You'll have to orientate your teams around how you do those things. Some of you are probably building tools. Some of you are probably just purely writing software these days, so you're worried about shipping products as well. So you're probably a lot more agile. You're probably dealing with product backlogs. Some of you may be lucky enough to even have a product manager in your teams. And of course, you need to keep reports. You need to keep them flowing. Everyone needs to see what you're doing and ensuring that your team's actually doing the kind of things everyone hopes you're doing. And of course, priorities change. You have to change things. Your strategic plans blow up mid-quarter because the organisation has changed something. This normally happens. You'll have to deal with, I want to say, ambitious engineers that just don't want to be managed and just want to go run off and go sit in a corner for a month and do their own thing. That's awesome, but it doesn't really work in an organisation that needs a lot of visibility. So trying to structure work around that can be a challenge. It can be done, but you've just got to be mindful of what your outcomes are, what are you trying to achieve. And keeping work visible. I know I don't love creating work tickets either, but it kind of is essential. And sometimes there are systems we love to hate. One thing I have learned, it's not the systems, it's generally the way people configure them the most. One of my favourite systems, I actually do like using it, I'm just going to say that. I'm not going to name the system, but if you look up what those things are in the Hindi language, I think you'll get the joke. So there you go. All right, so more facets. So what I've sort of described, I guess, is common even for software engineering managers, but for SRE managers, there's a little bit extra. You've got to be able to deep dive into tech. You don't need to troubleshoot some highly obscure configuration setting in the Linux kernel. It could probably help if you can, but you need to be able to have these conversations. What I have found is that success in my role looks like staying in closer contact with the technical side of the work. It's not all abstracted from that. I find that I'm less effective in my role if I don't look into things. We'll go into a little bit more about that later. You need to identify what are all these sacred cow systems the organisation depends on every single day to stay up. You need to keep them healthy at all times. You need to understand which are the kind of things that are sort of the keystone systems in an organisation and how to look after them too. You will deal with security issues. You will deal with servers that tend to go bump in the night, turning your on-call teams into zombies the very next day. You can't, as a manager, just offer condolences and go, don't worry about it. It's all right, tomorrow's another day, you'll be fine. Sometimes you've got to lean in on this, and sometimes you've actually got to really lean in on this, and I'll explain why that is critical for those of us in these roles. Monitoring, observability, dashboards, you kind of have a pretty good handle on that, what the kind of things you should be looking for. I'm not going to get into discourse between monitoring and observability and all that stuff. I'm not qualified to do that, but there's awesome talks on this subject. You will have to deal with comments thrown at you from different parts of the organization and try and put on your best face when you hear them. I'm not saying they're always wrong. I'm not saying they're always right either, but generally don't just repeat the same old things because you've heard someone else say it. And generally when things really go nuclear in a data center, you need to be that calm person in the room. If you are managing teams of people, you are looked on as a role model for behavior. If you run around screaming and yelling at people, that's probably what you'll get back. If you are a parent like me, if you yell at your kids, what do? They yell back at you. So, thoughts? All right, so the next part, managing work, because you're a manager. You need to manage work. And we all work in organizations, especially large ones that can get quite bureaucratic. How do you, as a manager, work your way through that? How do you keep people engaged? How do you avoid getting swamped with work? It's important to understand you are usually in a hierarchy somewhere. In very large organizations, that hierarchy can be quite large. It just tends to happen in very complex organizations. They tend to create hierarchies all the time. Hierarchies get more abstract the further up they go. So at the very top, people are imagining how the work is done. But down the bottom, that's where the work is actually being done. So there is a disconnect between these things. And yeah, look, I'm all in favor of flattening org hierarchies as well. But I did once work in an organization, did that, and one manager ended up with 50 direct reports and he resigned about 4 weeks later. So anyway, try and get it right. So what that looks like. So at the very top, you may want to move to the cloud, build a UFO and go to Mars, put a data center on the moon. All kinds of craziness happens up the top, and it'll come down, usually in OKRs, which seem to be the thing we're all doing. But you as an SRE manager, you have to translate this into work. And you have to show back up that the work your team is doing is aligning to it. The organization is going to want to know, we have your team, you have X amount of engineers, what are they doing? Are they succeeding on their goals? How are their goals aligning to our organization's goals? And how does it all roll up in our portfolio of work? This is pretty normal. What goes down must come back up. So at the bottom level, why sometimes some things won't make a lot of sense, having visibility into the work your teams do is critical. You do not want to be put in the position where someone go, so Andrew, what's your team working on? You're like, something amazing. It's not an answer, I promise you. I tried it, didn't work at all. Because the organization wants to know, what's the value you're giving? We're investing all of this money in this, what is the value we're getting back for the work you're doing? In a management role, you need to be able to explain these things. So the next part of the work, the one that seems to befoul us a lot in SRE is unplanned work. So unplanned work is the work you don't get back. This can be on-call incidents. This can be changes in priorities. This can be a system that all of a sudden needs a major upgrade because its licensing ran out mid-quarter and you actually now need to go and upgrade a whole bunch of stuff. This stuff happens. And you need to find effective ways as a manager to get rid of it. The more planned work you get back, generally the better you are going to be. You need to try and learn as much as possible from unplanned work. And I don't mean simply just creating a whole bunch of little action items and dealing with them, but what did you learn from this? What are the systemic issues that are causing this? Are there latent issues that you are just sitting there hoping won't go off until they do? How do you get that time back to plan for it and do it well? And here's one thing I've learned. If you're an SRE manager, you need to be on call. You cannot run a team of engineers who are doing on-call shifts and not pitch in and help. I have learned this lesson. I've learned it over a number of years. I hate the idea if I have an engineer who has been awake for the last 3 nights, if I can't dive in and help because my on-call rotation is short and I have people out on DTO. The second reason is it teaches me about unplanned work of my team. Because as a manager, you tend to get abstracted. You can't help it. You'll be pulled into a lot of different meetings and have a lot of different discussions. If you are not aware of the kind of challenges your engineers are facing, you can't deal with unplanned work effectively enough. It's not enough to avoid it. So I know for some people that can be a challenge. I'll admit I was an SRE IC before I was a manager, so I'm used to it. But if you are not doing on-call shifts as a manager, start learning how to do them, please. There are also anti-patterns. These are the kind of things, if ever I've gone into an organisation, these things I look for. Number one, my favourite, is the SRE silo, or the SRE proxy service. The notion that you have to have SREs because no one else can be trusted to do the thing, right? Or you have SRE teams that end up hoarding knowledge. That's not a good example. That is an anti-pattern, as is assuming that only SREs can be on call. I realise nowadays that is a lot less prevalent, but it still exists in some organisations. You need to ask questions. Do I really need to get woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning for this? I'll often ask that question every single time if I see that alert. You woke up at 2 a.m. to solve this problem. There was latency, there was error rates. Did you need to get woken up at 2 a.m.? Did you really, really need to get woken up at 2 a.m.? And if the answer is, well, not really, well, then fix it. Simple. Try and split your alerting, try and split what you have to unplanned respond to in business hours if you can. Sometimes these things can sit, sometimes they can't, but know the difference between the two so you don't end up playing whack-a-mole for every single incident. If you're wondering what that is, that's a cricket bat because I'm Australian, so it's not a baseball bat. You will need to coach people. Teach people how to do the thing. Write stuff down, do a screen capture. We're probably all using Macs from what I can see, so just use QuickTime screen capture. Narrate how to solve certain problems. Next time your partner teams come to you, point them to a video. Just watch that. Teach people how to do things. Don't hoard the knowledge to yourself, because if you teach others how to do this kind of work, you get more planned work back. You get back to actual engineering work, building stronger foundations, building stronger platforms for your partner teams to run on. You do not want to be caught in a constant reactive mode. So, to summarise, if you're a manager, your progress has to be visible to you and your team and your business. That's your job. You have to have visibility. You have to present it. If you're a manager, you need to do on-call shifts every once in a while. I don't mean do them every 2 weeks, but you should be able to hold your own and do that. You should learn from your incidents as much as possible, not just try and avoid them, but learn from the systemic issues and get rid of wasteful work. So, I've covered the basics of the role. I've covered what you can do. Some of you may think I've got a fair idea of what it means to be a manager. So I'm now going to share you possibly the most brutal piece of feedback I ever received. It was brutal. I had a great team. We were doing really good work. But a coworker once said to me, noticing certain, I want to say, bad habits, and people didn't want to deal with us. We were really good at what we did. The management hierarchy loved what we did, but people didn't want to deal with us. So I reflected on that a lot, and I went home and I was talking to my wife about it, and I got the second most brutal piece of feedback. Because my wife tends to be very direct, which is pretty good for me. What am I going to do about it? Because I can do something about it, or I could just perpetuate the same old crap. What am I actually going to do about it? So I started thinking pretty hard about this. Because I realised most of the time our team was pretty good. Sometimes it wasn't, but generally we were pretty good at what we did. The notion of a superhero culture, the notion of throwing out barbs, the idea that this title that you have at the end of your name means you're more right than someone else, we pretty much got rid of that. You know, I've always been a really big proponent. I don't care what your title is. I don't care what your experience is. If you work in a team, everyone has a right to be heard. Everyone has a right to feel included. So what was the problem? And I asked around. I looked at the organisations I worked in. I'm like, what is this problem? Why do we struggle in this area? And sometimes we just, well, we just put the roles out and these are the people that apply. It wasn't enough. So what was I going to do about it? I went out and I started talking to people. I started prioritising. If I was going to a conference like this, I'd go and listen to talks from people from underrepresented groups. different cultures in technology, people with neurodiversity, all these things. And I wanted to understand better about why we sucked at this. I looked at how we hired. I looked at the language in our roles and started asking. I asked women who I worked with, and they said, yeah, it sounds like it's a rock star or a ninja or a football club. This doesn't appeal to me. And so as I started building more and more of this information, I started understanding more and more, I actually started to realize where the problems were. So one skill that I'd learned earlier before this feedback was that diversity of skills in a team is great, but diversity of people is what makes teams the best they can possibly be. Because when you combine this, you get better diversity of ideas. You get better diversity of approaches. Your team collectively gets better. But it's not just about a numbers game. How do people feel supported? They've joined your team. Do they see your team as someone who is going to support them, support their career? When they get in a jam in the middle of the night with on-call, are people going to want to help them? Because that stuff's really important too. Because at the foundation of all of this is trust. If you've read 5 Dysfunctions of the Team, you're probably going, Andrew was swiped that from that. Yes, I shamelessly did, because Patrick has a point. Trust is the foundation of everything. It's the foundation of our personal relationships. It's as much as the foundation of our professional relationships. We want to be able to work in teams where we can feel free to be ourselves, to talk, and not be talked down to or spoken down to or categorized. I listened to a podcast recently with Ginny Rometty, and I really liked what she said here. I know there are multiple ways in which you could explain this, but I really like this quote, and it's one that I can identify with. And that foundation of trust is critical, because there are 2 months of the year as managers I hate, and I'm sure those of your ICs hate very much as well, and it's the performance process. So performance processes, like for some of us, I've worked in organisations where it's pretty straightforward. It's a quick conversation, you're doing great, you're doing good, here's some things to work on. Maybe you get some feedback, maybe you write this all up in a little report, usually 1 or 2 things that you're doing well, some areas to work on, have a conversation, go home, work on it. This was pretty normal in most organisations I'd worked in, small ones, or ones that were generally under several hundred people. It was pretty easy and seamless because trust was pretty high. In large organisations, you're probably finding yourself in what I noticed, or what is defined as the performance potential matrix. Big organisations like to do this. They want to understand how you're performing versus what is your potential, and where you sit on that. And obviously the goal is to be more in the top right than the bottom left. But the reason why they do this is so they know where everyone sits. So you as a manager need to do a lot more work in this process. You generally do a lot more documentation, because that's going to be reviewed, usually by your peers. And you're going to go through calibration sessions so you can work out, okay, based on all of these engineers in this org, where do we feel people are performing? Where do we feel their potential is? And usually the outcome of that, the organisation will have a budget. The system will work out based on where you are, any comp increases that you're going to get. In other organisations, sometimes the manager will apply discretion as well. This is generally to acknowledge the fact that systems don't always get it right. And sometimes managers who tend to be a little bit closer with their teams can distribute things as well. But here's the thing. If you're a manager, you need to be doing this. You need to have one-on-ones with every single member of your team, at least weekly or bi-weekly. If you're an IC, this is not happening, you need to ask your manager and make it happen. It's important that you connect with your managers, that you understand exactly what you're doing, check in on your work, understand how it aligns. Because surprises are great for birthdays, but they're not good for performance reviews, which I think goes without saying. If you're a manager, you can't just let things sit. If you've identified, you've witnessed behaviour or something that wasn't working, it's your responsibility to address it. Sometimes that can require a bit of courage, sometimes that can be a very emotional thing to do, but you need to do it. You can't just let things sit, because that's how toxic teams start getting created. If you're an IC, look at the role that you applied for. Understand the facets of that role. Some organisations probably list them side by side, so you will know generally what your role is and what your role isn't. Align your work to that. Understand how it is, what you're doing, what you're contributing, and how it meets the requirements of that role. If you've done some great Slack threads, you've got great commentary. If you've been doing, I don't know, great pull requests that you've done, maybe internal, maybe external to open source communities and things like that, note this stuff down. This is your contribution. Don't let it just vanish off into the ether, and get feedback. If you've done a great job, if you feel you can do things better, get feedback. Most of us will probably work with human resource management systems. They may support anonymous feedback, they may not, but find out what that is. And if you spend 10 minutes every week doing this, I can promise you, you will build up a great archive of the work you've done, the good things you've done, so when you go into those performance conversations, you're prepared. And more importantly, your manager will be prepared when your manager will go into calibration sessions. So when you're actually discussing the performance of people, you can say, you can point to this. You have all that documentation there. I currently have a team of 9 ICs who report into me. I cannot possibly remember each and everything they do. So always make sure, just keep doing this. We'll go over it in our one-on-ones. We'll just check back on it. Just make sure everything's on track. It's not difficult to do. You also have a right to know where you sit and where you're paid in terms of a salary band, if that's what you work, your bonus structure, your comp structure, and even magic beans, I don't know, whatever the hell it is. But know how this stuff works and learn how this works for you. It's really important. So, sum it all up. The most vital lesson I've learned, and the one that's probably been fundamental to any success I've had as a manager, is definitely about diversity and inclusion. And it's not about hiring rock stars and amazing tech people. It's important to know how you're assessed. Even if you're a manager, myself included, align your work, understand what you're doing and how it contributes to what is expected of you. If you're a manager, prioritize your one-on-ones, absolutely no exceptions. It is important to maintain communication with everyone in your team that creates that environment of trust, that environment where you are on top of the issues and you ensure everyone is working together happily, and learn and build your skills. Because as much as I know radical candor can sometimes be a book written, I guess, from only a few perspectives, there is one thing Kim gets absolutely right, and it's this. If you're a manager, it's about relationships. It is not about your individual technical brilliance. It is about the relationships you have with everyone in your team and the people around you. That is core to your job as a manager. So the last one I'm going to end is some management anti-patterns. Ones I've seen and how you can deal with them. The first one, rolling bad stuff downhill. Don't do it. You're a manager. Push back on things that you feel are unreasonable. Sometimes that can hurt. Sometimes that could be potentially career limiting, but your team is counting on you. Don't just shove stuff down because it's been shoved stuff down on you. Question it and push back. If you see negative behaviors further up the chain, that does not give you the right to go and repeat them in your teams or throw people under the bus. If you're a manager, block this stuff out. Don't pass this stuff down. Push back on this kind of behavior and call it out. If you're a manager, this does not mean you are better than anyone else because you have that title in your name, because you're not. Don't just assume that you're a manager and you're always right. Sometimes you do have to make calls. Sometimes they may not be in the best interest of everyone, but it still doesn't mean you're a better person than anyone else. It doesn't give you the right to work people into the ground. It does not give you the right to micromanage and deprofessionalize everyone because you think that's part of your job, because it's not. And if your organization is expecting that of you, yeah, probably not a great place to work. I can promise you this book does not exist. I've read a lot of books. I'm yet to find it. But one thing I will say is that generally reading a lot of books on management, leadership, SRE will help. You will pull out the parts of it. A lot of them, after you read enough of them, they all start pretty much telling you the same things over and over again, but in different ways. And also, don't just repeat the same old stuff you've been hearing, probably for most of your careers. Actually understand where these statements are coming from. Most of them are wrong. Some of them are taken completely out of context. Don't just latch onto it because you heard someone else say it, like me at a conference. Because you need to advocate for your teams. This is what people are expecting of you. So be that change that you want to see. So other things I've learned before I wrap it up. Learn from failure, understand how the work is done, get on call. Get really, really organized. I swear by tools like Trello and Roam Research. They are absolutely critical. I can't possibly remember each and everything, so I create little systems that help me remember certain things so I know where to look and where to find them. If anyone's familiar with Zettelkasten's and ways of taking notes, that has helped me probably more. And David Allen's Getting Things Done book really worked for me. Guard your calendar. If you're a manager, you leave your calendar open, I promise you it will fill up. You will always get called into meetings. Be ruthless about that. If you don't need to be at that meeting, don't turn up. If it's not that important, ask to get an offline perspective of it. And read, learn, and adapt.